The air in the dimly lit gym crackled with intensity, the sound of leather gloves smacking against heavy bags echoing through the space like distant thunder. The scent of sweat, liniment, and ambition hung thick in the atmosphere, a reminder that greatness was forged in places like these under flickering fluorescent lights, within the confines of battered rings where legacies were written with blood, toil, and the will to stand back up. Tonight, however, the conversations weren't about old fights, about past warriors whose names were carved into history. Tonight, the focus was on two of the most skilled, most elusive, and most polarizing fighters of this generation, Gervonta "Tank" Davis and Shakur Stevenson. The whispers had grown into heated debates, arguments that stretched beyond gyms and locker rooms, spilling into barbershops, social media threads, and the minds of boxing's most respected voices. Among them was a man whose words carried the weight of experience, whose opinion could slice through the noise and deliver something more than just speculation. Bernard Hopkins, a living legend, a fighter who had defied age and expectation, had seen it all, fought through it all. And tonight, he had something to say. The cameras were rolling, but Hopkins didn't care about the lens capturing his every movement. He had never been one to cater to narratives or tiptoe around uncomfortable truths. He spoke the way he fought, direct, unapologetic, and razor-sharp. He sat forward in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee, his eyes burning with a look that suggested he had already analyzed every possible outcome before anyone else had even begun to understand the question. The matchup between Davis and Stevenson wasn't just another fight. It wasn't just about skill or undefeated records or championship belts. This was about something deeper, something that had been brewing for years. Two paths, two styles, two mentalities that had finally arrived at an inevitable collision. And if anyone thought this would be a fight mired in controversy, in questionable scorecards or a disputed finish, Hopkins had a verdict that was as firm as the punches he had once thrown inside the ring. But before he spoke, before he unraveled his truth, the tension in the room thickened. Every eye was on him, every microphone tilted just slightly closer. The anticipation was suffocating, a pressure almost reminiscent of the final seconds before the opening bell. People wanted an answer. They wanted clarity. They wanted to hear from someone who had stood in their shoes, who had battled against men they said he couldn't beat, who had rewritten the rules of longevity in a sport that discarded its heroes as quickly as it crowned new kings. And so, Hopkins took a breath, leaned forward, and with the conviction of a man who had nothing to prove but everything to impart, he began to speak. But what he said first wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't a breakdown of styles, a tactical analysis, or a prediction that could be clipped and turned into a headline. No, what Hopkins said first made the room go silent, made even the most confident pundits shift uneasily in their seats. He spoke not of Davis's knockout power or Stevenson's defensive genius, but of something far more haunting, something that had defined boxing since the beginning of time. He spoke of what this fight represented beyond skill, beyond fame, beyond even the money that would flood into the pockets of everyone involved. He spoke of legacy. And as he uttered the word, there was something in his voice, a weight, a knowing, a hint that whatever came next would not be easy to hear. But it would be the truth. And once spoken, it could not be taken back. The clock on the wall ticked forward, a rhythmic reminder that this moment, this conversation, was more than just hype. Somewhere, in some gym, in some city, fighters were watching. Young men with gloves too big for their hands, shadowboxing against dreams that felt just within reach. They were listening. And whatever Hopkins said next would either reinforce what they believed about the sport, or shatter illusions they had clung to for too long. Because in boxing, in the unforgiving world of combat sports, truth was a rare thing. But when it came, when it hit, it landed harder than any punch ever thrown. The silence that followed Bernard Hopkins' words felt heavier than the air itself, pressing down on the room like the final seconds before a storm unleashes its fury. Legacy. It was a word that meant everything in boxing, Yet it was often misunderstood by those who never laced up gloves, never felt the sting of a punch meant to take them out, never stood under the blinding lights knowing that every move they made would be dissected, scrutinized, judged. Hopkins didn't just say the word, he wielded it, carving through the noise like a scalpel. And in that moment, every person listening knew this wasn't just another fight. Another pay-per-view spectacle designed to line pockets and fill arenas. This was something else, something more profound, more dangerous. Because legacy wasn't just about winning. It was about what remained when the dust settled, when the roar of the crowd faded, when the belts gathered dust on a forgotten shelf. It was about how a fighter was remembered. And for Gervonta Davis and Shakur Stevenson, the battle for that memory had already begun. Hopkins leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp, as if he could already see the outcome before it ever happened. But he didn't give his answer yet. He wasn't ready to lay down the final word, because to understand what was coming, one had to first understand what had led these two fighters to this moment. Davis, the relentless power puncher with the kind of knockout ability that could end careers in a blink, had built his reputation on destruction. His path to the top had been paved with bodies, fighters who had stepped into the ring believing they could withstand his fury, only to find themselves on the canvas, staring at the ceiling, wondering where it had all gone wrong. He had been doubted before, dismissed as just another knockout artist, a fighter who relied too much on raw power. But every time they said he would lose, every time they questioned whether he could handle adversity, he had answered with his fists, proving again and again that he was more than just power. He was precision. He was timing. He was a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then there was Stevenson. Where Davis was thunder, Stevenson was the calm before the storm. A master of control, of distance, of making opponents miss by inches and punishing them for even daring to throw a punch. He was not the kind of fighter who sought out destruction, he was the one who dismantled, who broke opponents not with sheer force, but with something more suffocating. The frustration of hitting nothing but air, the slow realization that every move had been anticipated, countered, neutralized. Fighters left the ring against Stevenson not just beaten, but bewildered, questioning everything they thought they knew about boxing. He wasn't just a defensive genius, he was a strategist, a technician who made fights look like chess matches, every piece moving exactly where he wanted, every decision leading to the inevitable checkmate. And that was why this fight was different. That was why it had captured the imagination of the boxing world in a way that few matchups ever did. Because it wasn't just about who would win, it was about what kind of fight it would be. Power against precision. Aggression against control. Two men who had dominated in their own way, now forced to answer the question neither had truly faced before. Could Davis catch Stevenson, break through the impenetrable defense, land the one shot that would change everything? Or would Stevenson make Davis swing and miss, make him pay for every wasted punch, make him question, for the first time, if his power alone was enough? Hopkins had seen these types of battles before. Styles made fights, but legacies were made when those styles clashed in ways that left no room for excuses. He had been in those wars himself, had faced men who wanted nothing more than to break him, to erase everything he had built with a single moment of brilliance. He knew what it was like to be doubted, to be told he was facing someone too young, too fast, too powerful. And he had defied them all. That was why his verdict carried weight, because he wasn't just speaking from opinion, but from experience. But he wasn't ready to give it just yet. Because the truth was, there were still questions that needed to be answered. There were still shadows in this story, hidden motives, lingering doubts that no one wanted to speak out loud but everyone felt just beneath the surface. Because this wasn't just about Davis and Stevenson. It was about the forces surrounding them, the people behind the scenes who had worked tirelessly to get them to this point. Promoters, managers, trainers, all with their own agendas, their own desires for how this fight should play out. In boxing, nothing was ever as simple as two men stepping into the ring. There were always whispers, always rumors, always those who wanted to control the narrative before the first punch was even thrown. And already, there were murmurs, questions about contracts, about negotiations, about whether this fight was even being made on equal terms. Stevenson's camp had voiced concerns. Davis's team had their own demands. And somewhere in the middle of it all was the truth, buried beneath layers of business, politics, and the ever-present reality that in boxing, nothing was ever guaranteed. And then there was the question no one wanted to ask. The question that hung in the air like an unspoken curse. What if this fight never happened? What if the politics of boxing, the greed, the hesitation, the games played behind closed doors robbed the world of what should have been a defining moment in the sport? Hopkins had seen it happen before. Fights that should have changed history, left to rot in the realm of what could have been. He had no patience for it. And if there was even a hint that this fight would be lost to the same fate, he was ready to call it out. But for now, he remained silent, letting the weight of his own thoughts linger in the air. The cameras were still rolling. The world was still waiting. And somewhere, in some corner of the fight world, Davis and Stevenson were watching. Maybe they weren't in the same room, maybe they weren't even thinking about Hopkins in this moment, but they would hear his words soon enough. And when they did, when they saw the fire in his eyes, the certainty in his voice, they would know what was at stake. Because there was no controversy here. No debate about whether one man was more deserving than the other. No question about whether this was the fight that needed to happen. The only question left, the only thing that still hung in the balance, was whether Davis and Stevenson were truly ready for what was coming. Because when the bell finally rang, when the world stopped to watch them fight, there would be no place to hide. No excuses. No safety nets. Just two men, two legacies, and the truth waiting to be revealed. And that truth, once spoken, would change everything. The weight of Bernard Hopkins' words had settled like an invisible force over the room, hanging in the air long after he had spoken. There was no mistaking the gravity of the moment, no denying that what had started as a simple discussion about skill and strategy had now transformed into something far more layered, far more complicated. Because beneath all the analysis, all the stylistic breakdowns and historical comparisons, there was an uncomfortable reality creeping to the surface, one that no one had dared to say outright but was now impossible to ignore. The fight between Gervonta Davis and Shakur Stevenson was not just a collision of styles or a battle for supremacy. It was a test, an ultimatum, a moment that would define the very nature of modern boxing. But as Hopkins let his words settle, his eyes scanning the faces around him, there was something unspoken in his expression, something that hinted at a knowledge that stretched beyond what had been discussed. He had seen something no one else had noticed yet. And as the cameras kept rolling, as the tension deepened, he was about to make it known. The first crack in the foundation came not from Hopkins himself, but from a voice in the back of the room. A journalist, one of the few who had been given access to this private conversation, cleared his throat and hesitated before speaking. "You keep saying there's no controversy," he started, carefully choosing his words. "But what about the rumors? What about the people saying this fight isn't going to happen at all?" His words sent a ripple through the gathered crowd, a murmur of unease sweeping through the room. It was a question that no one had wanted to ask, a possibility that had been whispered about behind closed doors but never spoken aloud in front of cameras. And yet there it was out in the open, undeniable now. Because while the world had been gearing up for this showdown, while fans had been debating who would come out on top, while Davis and Stevenson had been building toward what was supposed to be the most significant fight of their careers, something had been happening in the shadows. Something that threatened to unravel it all. Hopkins' expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't react in the way people expected. Instead, he leaned forward again, his fingers pressing together, as if weighing his next words with the same precision he had once used to calculate his counterpunches. "You know what the problem is?" he finally said, his voice calm, deliberate. The problem is that too many people think this sport is about fighters. It's not. It never has been. His eyes swept across the room, daring anyone to challenge him. It's about power. About control. About the people who sit in offices and make decisions while the fighters put their lives on the line. And right now, those people are playing a dangerous game. A hush fell over the crowd. Because Hopkins wasn't talking about Davis or Stevenson anymore. He wasn't talking about game plans or strengths or weaknesses. He was talking about something deeper, something more insidious. And the moment he said it, the doors to speculation burst open. Was this about promoters? Was it about contract negotiations, television deals, the unseen hands that dictated which fights were made and which ones were buried before they ever had a chance to materialize? The boxing world had seen this before, fights that should have been made, matchups that fans had begged for, only to be blocked by business, by greed, by the egos of those who stood to profit the most. And now, for the first time, it was being suggested that Davis versus Stevenson might be heading down the same path. But it wasn't just about money. Not this time. There was something else, something deeper beneath the surface, and Hopkins knew it. He had been around too long not to recognize when the game was being played at a level most people couldn't see. The real question wasn't just whether the fight would happen. The real question was why there were people who didn't want it to happen. And that was where the twist came. Because what if this wasn't just about business? What if someone somewhere had already decided the outcome long before a punch had been thrown? The thought alone was enough to send a chill through the room. Hopkins wasn't throwing out baseless accusations. He was stating a reality that had existed in boxing for decades. Fighters had been manipulated before. Contracts had been written with invisible ink, filled with clauses designed to keep the control in the hands of the few. And sometimes, fights had been lost before they ever started, not because of skill, not because of strategy, but because the right people had made the wrong calls. Somewhere in the background, a phone buzzed, a faint vibration cutting through the heavy silence. It was a reminder that outside of this room, the world was still moving. Fans were still arguing. Money was still being discussed. And yet, here in this moment, it felt like something had shifted, like an invisible line had been crossed. If what Hopkins was implying was true, if there were forces working behind the scenes to manipulate this fight, then this was bigger than just Davis versus Stevenson. This was about the integrity of the sport itself. And suddenly, the focus wasn't just on the two fighters anymore. It was on the people who surrounded them, the ones pulling the strings. The promoters who had built their empires on the backs of warriors. The networks that controlled who got airtime and who was left in the dark. The managers and advisors who whispered in fighters' ears, shaping their decisions, guiding their careers not based on what was best for them, but on what was best for business. And now, the question everyone was too afraid to ask was lingering in the air. Had this fight already been decided before it even began? Hopkins didn't answer that question. He didn't need to. Because the look in his eyes said everything. He had seen too much, been through too much, to believe that boxing was ever as simple as two men stepping into a ring. And if there was any truth to the whispers, if there was even a chance that something was being orchestrated behind the scenes, then this fight was no longer just about legacy. It was about something much darker. Outside, the world was still waiting. The fans, the analysts, the fighters themselves, all of them were preparing for a war inside the ring. But inside this room, the battle had already begun. And as the tension thickened, as the reality of what was happening began to take shape, one thing became painfully clear. This fight wasn't just about Davis versus Stevenson anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. And when the truth finally came out, when the first real punch was thrown not inside the ring, but outside of it, boxing itself might never be the same again. The storm that had been brewing behind the scenes was now rolling in, and Bernard Hopkins could see it unfolding in real time. The whispers that had once been confined to backrooms and hushed phone calls were beginning to seep into the public consciousness. Fans, journalists, and even those within the boxing world who had once dismissed the rumors were now forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that this fight, this colossal battle that was supposed to define a generation, was carrying an invisible weight far heavier than titles or rankings. Something was being manipulated. Something was being controlled. And Hopkins, a man who had spent his career tearing through illusions, wasn't about to let it slide without exposing the truth. But before he could speak, before he could lay everything bare, a new development sent shockwaves through the boxing world. A leaked contract surfaced online, a document that was never meant to see the light of day. It was supposed to remain buried beneath layers of red tape, hidden from the fighters themselves, but now, it was out in the open for everyone to see. And what it revealed was more damning than anyone had expected. The terms were lopsided, drastically so. Stevenson's team had agreed to certain clauses, believing they were standard, but buried deep in the fine print was something that changed everything. A rematch clause, but not in the way most would expect. If Stevenson won, the rematch would be at a different weight, under a different set of conditions that heavily favored Davis. It wasn't a standard contract, it was a trap. A setup. A way to ensure that no matter what happened in the ring, the control stayed with the people orchestrating it from behind the curtain. And just like that, the question was no longer about who would win, it was about whether this was even a real fight at all. The world erupted. Fans flooded social media, demanding answers. Fighters, past and present, weighed in, some outraged, some unsurprised, all of them knowing deep down that this was the dark underbelly of the sport they loved. And then, in a moment that stunned everyone, Stevenson himself spoke out. He took to social media, his words measured but his fury unmistakable. "I fight because I love this sport," he wrote. "But I will never be a pawn in someone else's game. If this fight isn't on equal terms, it doesn't happen. I don't care what they try to do." For a moment, everything hung in the balance. Stevenson had drawn a line in the sand. The people in control, the ones who had spent years shaping careers, crafting narratives, ensuring that power stayed in the hands of the few, were now faced with something they hadn't anticipated. A fighter who was willing to walk away. And if he did, what would it mean? Would the fight collapse? Would Davis be forced to fight under fair conditions? Or would the whole thing dissolve into the mess of negotiations and legal battles that had killed so many fights before? And then, the twist no one saw coming. Davis, the man who had been painted as the power-punching force with no regard for the politics of the sport, responded. Not with arrogance. Not with indifference. But with something that sent a chill through everyone watching. "I came here to fight. No games. No politics. If they're trying to play with this fight, they can count me out too." The impact of his words was instant. Two of the most dominant fighters in the sport, men who had built their reputations in completely different ways, were now united against the very machine that had brought them to this moment. It wasn't just about Stevenson anymore. It wasn't just about Davis. It was about control. About the fighters taking it back. And for the first time in years, maybe even decades, the power structure of boxing itself trembled. The promoters scrambled. Networks rushed to control the damage. Statements were made, denials issued, but it was too late. The truth had already spread. And the fans, the ones who had been waiting for this fight more than anything, made their voices heard. They didn't want negotiations. They didn't want politics. They wanted a real fight. And in a move that no one expected, something that had never happened in modern boxing occurred. Stevenson and Davis, without their teams, without their promoters, without the executives dictating their every move, made a call. Just the two of them. A conversation that lasted minutes but changed everything. A week later, a new announcement shook the sport. The fight was happening. On neutral terms. No hidden clauses. No backroom deals. Just two fighters, stepping into the ring, letting their fists decide. It was unprecedented. It was risky. And it was exactly what boxing needed. And when the night of the fight finally arrived, when the arena was packed and the world watched, it wasn't just about Davis versus Stevenson anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about proving that, for all the corruption, all the manipulation, all the greed that had poisoned the sport, there were still fighters who refused to be controlled. There were still moments of purity, of honor, of raw, unfiltered combat where the best fought the best without interference. And as the first bell rang, as the fighters met in the center of the ring, one thought echoed through the minds of every person watching. This wasn't just a fight. This was a revolution. And no matter who won, boxing itself had already changed forever.